What about your kids? You know, your kids are going to ask. I asked my mother, 1973. I'm sure people ask it all over the place. And imagine you're white and your kid says, how come you can always tell somebody's black even if you can't see them, Mommy? The impulse is to say that's not true. Black people sound like Southerners. And you know that's not true. Or the impulse is to say, no, everybody talks in different ways. You shouldn't stereotype. If your kid has an IQ over 40, they're going to think, I'm not stereotyping, I'm hearing the truth. So what do you tell the kid? And I think that we need to get comfortable saying black people have a slightly different sound because they often spend more time with one another, just like white people sound more like one another because they tend to spend more time together. And that's true of all human groups. That's not racist. It's just true and harmless. There's nothing wrong with the way Viola Davis sounds as opposed to the way Melissa McCarthy sounds. But she definitely sounds black. And I can tell you, because she does the voice of a queen on the Disney cartoon series, Sophia the First. Yes, it's in my house because I have small children. And once I had my back turned and the queen said something and I had never seen that character. And it was that little bell that went off. I thought, the queen is black. Is she? And I turned around and I forget what the queen looks like, but I went on to IMDb. Who does the queen? It was Viola Davis. It wasn't an accident, and I don't have any special powers. I was hearing what any American can hear. There's a black sound. So I have a chapter about that in the book. Third thing in the book is the answer to an objection that is traditionally leveled against arguments that black English is okay. Well, they can't talk that way in a job interview. Somebody always says that. So somebody is talking about what some of the complexity might be, about how you shouldn't mock the language because you're mocking the speakers. And somebody will say, yes, that's true, but they can't talk that way at a job interview. But, okay, nobody said they were going to. Nobody needs to be told that. And I think that why you get that response is because of a sense that we often have that the way somebody speaks casually is going to interfere with their ability to speak the formal variety where they are. Now with black English, that's even worse because everybody thinks it's mistakes. So it's assumed that if you talk that way, you won't be able to speak standard. But even if we understand that it's not mistakes, there's a sense that, well, if you use that system, it will keep you from using the standard. That is an American kind of misimpression, a perfectly understandable American misimpression, because our dialect diversity here is relatively thin. English hasn't been here for 2,000 years, as it has in, for example, England, where different ways of speaking have been doing this for much longer. And so there are kinds of English there that barely sound like English to us. America is 15 minutes old, and so we don't have that depth of this. I'm not going to call it dialect diversification. That sounds like a disease. It's just that there hasn't been as much of this going on. Some, Gullah Creole, South Carolina, Hawaiian Pidgin, Louisiana Creole French. But those varieties are all spoken literally on the geographical margins of the space. And Louisiana Creole French is essentially extinct. And it's not that many people who speak those. For the most part, there are dialect differences, but there's a certain vanilla aspect to the way English goes here. Black English is the most divergent form of English that most people living in the United States have any reason to hear. So, what we miss is that living in two very different dialects of the same thing is a very ordinary human experience, and in the legions of places where this is normal, nobody worries that speaking the home thing is going to interfere with speaking the formal thing. Nobody in Sicily is worried that somebody who speaks Sicilian is going to use it in a job interview instead of standard Italian. And in Sicily, standard Italian is the Italian that a language fan, takes some of in college or something like that. Then there's Sicilian, which really is different enough from that if you roll the dice again and if Sicily were a separate country, Sicilian will be considered a separate Romance language. It's very different. And if you see something like The Godfather or some episodes of Boardwalk Empire, you'll see characters translated using Sicilian rather than standard Italian because it's different enough that to anybody who knows the territory, to show those characters speaking textbook college classroom Italian would be ridiculous. Whenever you see one of those Sicilians in, say, The Godfather speaking that language, they're really speaking something almost as different from Italian as Spanish. But that person speaks standard Italian in school, in the job interview. There's no debate in Sicily about whether Sicilian threatens standard Italian. It would never occur to anybody. Similar is in most Arab-speaking countries. If you know somebody who speaks Arabic, when they say I speak Arabic, they really mean I speak Latin and French. They speak two things. They speak the standard language, then what they learned on their mother's knee is something so different that it is, although often the speakers feel funny having it put this way because of cultural unity, it's a different language. If you know a Moroccan, the language they learned at home is like French. Then they went to school and they learned something like Latin. A Moroccan will say, I learned Moroccan and then I learned Arabic. Any Arabic speaker that you know, unless they're roughly from Malta, is like that. They wouldn't say that they're bilingual. But the idea that Egyptian Arabic is a threat to standard Arabic, no. I mean, as I mentioned this, there's an article in the New Yorker last week that actually addresses at almost beautiful length. You know, a linguist gets to this article and thinks, all right, this article is going to run 5 minutes. But it actually dwells on standard Arabic and Egyptian Arabic. And the idea that people need to let go of the Egyptian because it threatens the standard, no, if anything, it's the other way around. Black English is the same thing. So what it is that Black English speakers are, going to hit you with some terminology, diglossic, two tongues. And this isn't a term just made up for black people in the United States. This is people speaking all over the world. The idea that you learn something on your mother's knee or father's knee, and then you go to school and pretty much that same way of speaking is what your teachers use, and that same way of speaking is on the printed page, and everybody around you speaks that way, and so you have learned this standard formal way of speaking at home. That sounds so normal to us, that is very strange as a linguistic experience. I would venture that at least every second person in the world would never dream of that being the situation. And that was even more the case until about 200 years ago when literacy became widespread in many parts of the world such that vernacular languages were used on the page. For a very typical experience, there are no figures on this, but a very typical experience is that the way you speak most spontaneously is with your family and friends. You go to school and what's on the page is something rather different. It's not a different language, but it's different. It's as if you say house, but what's on the page is domicile. And you just have to know. Nobody imposes it. It's just the way it's always been. And you just make your way and you learn that school way. That's humanity. That's how it works. Only about 100 of the world's 7,000 languages are written in any real way. So most people have to make a kind of a jump. Black English is that situation. Black people have a larger English than most white people. I wanted to call one of my very first books A Larger English, and they didn't like that. And so what I meant was that black people have more English. So nobody's going to try to use black English at a job interview if we understand that it's really an okay form of speech, but different. Something else that any black person intuits is that there's a way you speak here and then another way that you speak there. So black English is not a problem in that way.